Okay. Hi everyone. This is our University Anthropology Society and University Economic Society, University Andrews Economic Society in collaboration, migration, interdisciplinary discussions, migration and labor event. We have 4 great speakers today. Thank you everybody for coming. Um, we're just gonna get straight right into it. And yeah, we're gonna ask the speakers to give a short introduction of their research and in regards to the topic, and then we'll go into questions. So we're gonna start with Dr. Di Wu.
Right. I do have some PowerPoint slides. Hopefully it will work. It's just some pictures I took on a few work. Please let me know if you can see it. Yeah, great. Hi, my name's Di Wu, and then I'm currently a departmental lecturer at the University of Oxford, sitting at the Department of Social Anthropology. I was trained in anthropology as well. So today I'm going to talk about some of the aspects appearing, especially in relation to the labor migrations and the labor management during my fieldwork in Zambia. So I gave a kind of a tentative title called Practising Chinese Socialism in Zambia, Everyday Labor Management at a Chinese Construction Company in Lusaka. So before I go into the topic, just a little bit kind of background information about my field sites. So I did my field work back to 2010 and 2012. So my main field site was a educational farm named as China Zambia Agricultural Technology Demonstration Center. So it's part of the Chinese state-sponsored kind of agricultural aid projects across the whole African continent. By then, there were 23 kinds of agricultural education centers being built across the north of, for example, Ethiopia, and to the south of South Africa. And my main field center was one of those. And then it was during the time when I was starting my field work, it was the phase of kind of a late construction, just about to complete. So I got the chance to did a little bit kind of 3 month field work with the construction company, which is from China as well. It's called Jiangxi Overseas Construction. It's the sort of nature of that company used to be a state enterprise at a provincial level, but during the early 2000s, when China reformed kind of a state ownerships on enterprises, the company was sold to private entrepreneurs in China. And then because the network link with the state enterprises, so the private entrepreneurs who took over made lots of kind of state contracts. And then this was one of the state contracts they were building on. So my kind of the main points I'm going to cover for this talk is based on this kind of experience and fieldwork with this construction company. As you can see, so this is the structure. So typically, the Chinese construction companies, when they were building roads or building stadiums in African countries, this case in Zambia, building a agricultural farm, they organize the labor into a work unit compound. So the compound is gated and it's highly controlled by personnel. And then there's this, as you can see, within this courtyard. So it's usually a combination of work and life and entertainment all happening in one compound. So as you can see this picture, so what usually tend to be the arrangement is the worker will have their own office. At the same time, this is where he or she sleeps at night. This is the bed here. And then during the off work hours, they will do laundries in the same courtyard and do the and also on this corner, there's where the canteen, the hall is. And then during the spring and summer seasons, they would plant some vegetables in this piece of land as well for the self-consumption. So with these organizations of accommodations, so workers usually have a kind of the blurred line between the public and the private, and bring work and life all merged into one compound. And this compound, as I said before, is heavily controlled, not just physical control, but also financially controlled. So typically, Chinese workers will be sent to Zambia with 2 or 3 years contract, and at the end of the contract, they will go back to China, and then their salaries will be paid directly to the Chinese account they hold in China, not to the account. They don't have an account in Zambia. So they will typically get allowances about at that time was $50 per month, and then just in case they want to buy cigarettes or some souvenirs, etc. And usually, because the logistic constraints, so the workers won't have chance to go out of the compound, but the work does organize trips, usually once 2 months or 3 months, to a theme park or to a local market, just for a day out. And then within this compound living arrangement, the relationship is very hierarchical. The arrangement is very hierarchical. They would import the kind of administrative hierarchies from China, and then according to the rankings, they arrange the room and arrange the locations, arrange the welfare assignments, etc. And then also the hierarchy is not just demonstrated from the Chinese side, but also it's a racial hierarchies. So the Zambian workers, typically they won't allow to go into this compound unless they're doing service. For example, cooking or cleaning or maintaining the ground, for example. They would be able to get into the gate, but usually the Zambian workers won't be allowed to get into the compound. Also, the kind of hierarchies manifested through the proportions of how the labor between the Chinese workers and the local workers arranged. Usually, you have one Chinese worker as a team leader, and then supervising 3 local workers, and then in the daily kind of construction work. So it's a 1-to-3 ratio. Apart from the arrangement, which resembles to what work unit and especially the workers' commune used to be, also the day-to-day kind of arrangement, how the political ideological work is arranged, also resembles to what the Chinese companies used to run in China as well. So every week on Mondays, there will be 3 hours meetings for every week, no matter how busy the schedule is, for all the workers get together in the conference room, which is also in the compound. This is the compound room, the arrangement of that. So to learn materials, which is assigned by the central office, so it's typically called thought work conference meetings. So what's within these materials usually is the stories of the managers at higher kind of ranking managers, how hardworking they are, and how they suffered the tough conditions in Africa, but still keeping the spirits going on. So and also to encourage the workers on the ground to copy of what's the spirit of a hardworking ethics of the leader. So the thought work kind of conferences is not just to kind of keep workers' morale in a way, everyday morale to work hard, but also to keep the workers' political thoughts in line. So to not, in a way, not what they term is not contaminated by the free life or by what they see in Zambia or by what they heard from the Western media as well. So so this kind of a mode of thought work is not just between the Chinese workers, but also how Chinese when they face the local complaints from the Zambian workers, they usually do this type of work as well to the local Zambian workers and to talk them through how life is hard anyway. So we need to suffer in order to develop, to get better, and to work harder, and to keep line of we need to comply with the company's principles and disciplines in order to make a better future together. So all this, what I'm going to say is all these kind of ethnographic data trying to point out one of the aspects which the China-Africa migration studies haven't been paid attention to is how socialist mentalities and legacies, especially in terms of how socialism kind of practices on labor management hasn't is continuing being done in Chinese companies in Africa. So this hasn't been paid enough attention by the scholars. So that's just overall for my talk today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your talk and your summary of your research, Diwu. Now we will go to David and for his talk.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for having me. This is a very nice initiative indeed. And I didn't know that we had to give a full project description. So I will try to give my talk off the bat. And I will present to you a new project that I am working on. And let me share my screen. All right. So I guess that you can see my screen now, right? Great. All right. So first of all, I'm David Escamilla-Guerrero. I am based in the School of Economics and Finance at St. Andrews. I'm an economist with research interests lying in the intersection between economic history, labor economics, and migration. Okay. And what I work with is with individual level data, specifically border crossing records from immigrants, Mexican immigrants to the United States. And the project that I'm currently working on is titled Understanding Refugee Migration During the Age of Mass Migration, Evidence from the Mexican Revolution. Okay. And this is joint work with Ed Kosek and Zach Ward, who are in US universities. Okay, so the main objective of this paper is to understand, using microdata, the incentives behind refugee migration. It may be very obvious that refugees are escaping from, conflict, and that is true. But at the same time, I don't know if you can see it, but there are many other individuals that choose to stay, even if there are some factors affecting their overall welfare. Okay, and overall, what we believe is that, in fact, it is quite difficult to understand the decision to move when looking at refugee migration. And this is because it is difficult to gather data on all the factors that influence this decision. And what I meant by factors, it could be, for instance, the persistence of violence, the intensity of conflict, whether you sympathize with a particular faction that is involved in the conflict, or whether this conflict affected overall infrastructure, right? So again, let me just highlight that even in contemporary context, gathering data of these elements is quite complicated. So for this reason, we focus on a historical civil war. This is the Mexican Revolution. And for you to have a sense of why the Mexican Revolution is relevant, well, from 1910 to 1920, when the Mexican Revolution took place, about 1.4 million died, and 350,000 Mexicans crossed the border to escape this conflict. All right, and in a historical perspective, the Mexican Revolution was one of the most deadliest conflicts during the 20th century. All right, so let me motivate a little bit more my summary with this picture. And here, what you can see are two maps. On top, you have pre-revolution local level sources of Mexican migration. What I'm plotting here are migration rates at the municipality level, and then you can see how there is a dramatic change by the end of the Mexican Revolution, right? So it is very clear that this conflict changed dramatically the migration patterns. And the objective of this research is to pinpoint exactly which factors were the most relevant to explain these changes. So we have an amazing data set. On the one hand, we have newly digitized high-frequency migration data, and this data consists of individual border crossings, as I mentioned before, registered at 24 entry ports along the Mexico-U.S. border. For you to have a sense of the explanatory power that we will get from this data, our sample size is about more than 200,000 unique crossings. And the period that we will be covering is from 1906 to 1920. Moreover, something that is amazing about this data is that the frequency is daily. We observe daily border crossings, right? And as I showed you before, the geographical unit are municipalities. Then the other data source is a newly digitized high-frequency insurgency events. These insurgency events are classified into several categories, and the most important are shootings, combats, battles, and sieges. So basically here, these categories will capture, like kind of different nature of these events. What we have here is a sample size of about 2,411 unique events. The period covered, here's a typo, is 1910 to 1915. And also we have a high frequency data here, meaning that we are observing these events in a daily basis. And in this case, we even have a more fine-grained data because we are able to classify these events using latitude and longitude, right? Okay, so I think that one of the main contributions of this project is actually the digitization process that we just ended 1 month ago or so. And this process consisted of digitizing all these insurgency data that comes from a book, a history of the military history of the Mexican Revolution. And well, as you can imagine, it's a 8 volumes, 2 annexes. We spent huge time reading all these pages, identifying all the events, classify them, and well, this will be our like a kind of a secondary contribution of the project, but from the perspective of history, it would be another important contribution. So what elements are captured in this insurgency data? Well, we can obtain by event the number of military casualties, the number of civil casualties as well, who was the winner by each event, right? Whether they were damages to civil infrastructure, we will have the categorization of the event, as I mentioned before, and also, which is super important, whether the winner stayed at the at that specific location and created an influence area, right? So what I'm just describing here are all these elements that are difficult to observe nowadays, but due to the fact that we have access to all these military reports, we can collect all this data for a historical event. Okay. All right. So there are some caveats when you work with data. There are always some problems, and the first one is that return migrants are not reported consistently, and therefore we won't be able to say anything about return migration, and we do not observe the refugees' destination either. Okay. Regarding the insurgency data, sometimes the military casualties are reported as uncountable casualties. We are currently working on a methodology to overcome this limitation, but this is something to keep in mind. And it is unknown for how long the winners stayed in their influence areas, right? There are other caveats to this data, but I'm just summarizing very quickly this project. Okay, so for you to have a notion of how these events can be distributed across the Mexican territory, we plot the specific location and their intensity using an influence radius of 15 kilometers. And what you are observing here is the intensity in terms of length, meaning how many days the conflicts lasted, right? So you can see that there is a huge concentration in the center of Mexico, where Mexico City is, which is quite obvious, the reason, because the different factions wanted to control that area. But at the same time, you can see that there is huge variation across the space. And therefore, we will be using this variation to identify the main factors that influence the decision to move of refugees. We can also plot the data using military casualties as a measure of intensity, and the picture changes a little bit. So this is how the insurgency events look like over time, and you can see that there are like different periods where these events peaked. So we will define this as the first stage of the Mexican Revolution. The period covered between these lines is the second stage, and then the final stage. So you can see that perhaps the most violent period is the one that took place between March 1913 to August 1914. Okay, this is something equivalent, but using civil damage data, right? And these are the three periods that I'm talking about, right? You can see that there are important differences in terms of conflict intensity. Then you have the number of events by period and the type of events as well, right? Here you can see the breakdown by period. All right, so here, very quickly, just to finish, and I think that this is super interesting, I will show you the spatial dynamics that we have been working with this data, and I will end my summary there. So just let me share again my screen, because I have to show you my QGIS screen. Right. So if you keep in mind these three periods that I mentioned before, so we have here the first period, the spatial distribution of the events during the first period of the Mexican Revolution, right? And you can see huge concentration in the center, no news, and huge concentration in the northwest part of the country, right? The size of the circles capture the intensity of the events, right? Then, if we plot data of the second period, then you can see how there is very little overlap, right? So you can see that these dynamics over time are important to consider in order to understand the refugee flows, right? And finally, if we plot the third stage of the Mexican Revolution, then you can see that basically there were very few municipalities where the Mexican Revolution didn't have any impact, right? So overall, you can see here that the granularity of the data is super important and will provide us with a lot of information, okay? So I will leave it here, and thanks again for this initiative.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for your summary of your project, David. It was very interesting. So I think we'll move on to Nassim.
Thank you. So my name is Nassim. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I've recently come back from my fieldwork. Of course, I'd like to thank everyone for this opportunity. And in the next few minutes, 5-7 minutes, what I'd like to do is actually use an ethnographic vignette to illustrate the kinds of impediments experienced by migrant women facing deportation based on the latest UK immigration rules after the termination of their spousal visa following the breakdown of their transnational marriages. So my study is around women who have come here on a spousal visa and then their marriages break down, and then what happens to them. So these women often face homelessness, poverty, social isolation, domestic abuse, poor mental health, and which, together with their very weak English language skills, insecure immigration status, and poor integration into UK life, can present numerous difficulties in securing employment. So, I'm still coming together with what I'm going to be saying in my thesis, but just as an interim initial thought, what I'm arguing is that a person-centered understanding of migrant experience, and in this case, participation in the labor market, needs to consider the impact of a combination of the physical, i.e. the spatial, the social, and the emotional factors, which taken together, I've sort of termed it as the migratory physmos. And why have I chosen this term? I've chosen this term because I have observed how the combined overlapping effects of the quality of the physical spaces, the social circumstances, together with a range of the emotional challenges affecting such women's abilities to live and to work to their best potential. So in order to illustrate my point, may I introduce you to Shazia? Shazia is a young girl who hails originally from a small town in Bangladesh, and who, along with 9 other newly arrived migrant women in 3 different UK cities, forms the focus of my PhD research, which I commenced in October 2018. And since then, I've been studying the precarity faced by these newly arrived South Asian brides who have experienced domestic abuse and family breakdown. For the 2 years before I started my PhD, I was working as a life coach and a counselor to other women just like Shazia. And I also taught English as a foreign language in a local charity. What this has done is that it has afforded me the chance to come quite close to my subjects over a period of many years. And actually, in fact, I still keep in touch with all of them just because of the nature of who they are and the kind of experiences that they are undergoing. So coming back to Shazia. In Shazia's case, as soon as she reached the age of 16, Shazia was betrothed to her husband, a UK citizen, and her schooling was stopped. Upon arriving in the UK, Shazia experienced 5 years of domestic abuse until her husband handed her to the police with charges of assault and theft. Her parents, who lived back in Bangladesh, blamed her for the marital breakdown, and until today, Shazia remains ostracized by her family. And that is, no one talks to her. She is completely alone in this world. The police placed Shazia in a safe home for 7 months while she applied for legal rights to remain in the UK. During this time, Shazia overdosed several times in an attempt to end her life. Once the UK Home Office accepted her application on the grounds of domestic abuse, Shazia was transferred out of her safe home into a different city, and she was assigned a new support worker. Here, Shazia has spent 9 months living in a room in home office accommodation, which she is sharing with 5 previously completely unknown housemates, all from different nationalities. Shazia receives £37 a week for her personal expenses, but she is not allowed to take up any paid work. During this time, she was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. Her poor mental health meant that her attendance in her free English class was pretty irregular. The thing is that the abuse that she had suffered, together with her social isolation and her anxiety over her precarious legal and economic status, further compounded her mental health, and it depleted her energy, it eroded her sense of self-worth. So 9 months later, Shazia gains a refugee status in the UK. And what happens is that she has to leave her home office accommodation within 28 days, and she finds herself homeless, living mostly in and out of mixed gender hostels. Finally, she's given a bedsit by her local council. Now, during all this time, Shazia is living on benefits while she's trying to improve her English and she's looking for a job. The stresses of her life is immense, and what you find is that she overdoses several more times and along with the overdosing, she's also suffering poor physical and mental health. Now, to understand the multifarious overlapping effects that Shazia's migratory situation has had on her well-being, let us return back to the 3 main constituents of what I have called the migratory physmals, the term that I spoke about a little earlier. Firstly, the physical spaces. Explaining the psychospatial effects of the precariousness of her immigration status, her homelessness, and her experiences of living in mixed gender hostels, Shazia said to me that she felt extremely insecure, she was pretty panicky, and often extremely scared. Secondly, on a psychosocial level, I have observed the challenges posed by Shazia's very flimsy and irregular support networks. She had friendships, but they were very tenuous. She had support workers, but her contact with the support workers was very irregular, sometimes not for many weeks. And she had complete absence of any family relationships in her life. Shazia's past abuse, her lack of qualification in the UK job market, her limited education, and knowledge of UK life, together with her poor language skills, further added to all her challenges. And thirdly, coming to what I have viewed as psychosomatic, what I have seen is that Shazia suffered from several mental health issues, as well as very low self-worth and confidence. Although she was on medication, she had no access to trauma-focused therapy to help explore the history of her abuse. Put together, you could see that Shazia was living shackled with a host of complex symptoms such as sleeplessness, bodily aches and pains, poor attention span, low energy and mood. In Shazia's case, as with many others, I have visited her GP and her therapist with her. I have read her medical reports and I have seen her medical prescriptions. And although it is hard to fully determine the precise etiology of these symptoms, I would argue that at least some of them have emotional and psychosomatic origins. Having finally obtained the legal rights to work, Shazia then applied for various menial jobs. While she was illegal and while she was applying for a legal status, she was not allowed to work. But once you get legal status, you have a right to work. But she had a very skeletal CV, which she gave to local shops, to acquaintances. She tried to make online job applications with help from people like myself and others, but to no avail. Finally, she entered the cash in hand below the minimum wage job market. But she had to leave very quickly. Well, actually, she stayed there for almost 9 months because her working conditions were extremely poor and her mental health challenges were very difficult for her to face. Then at last, during Christmas time, Shazia found part-time work on a 0-hour contract. But again, as soon as the Christmas period was finished, she was jobless again, until finally she found a 12-hour-a-week job contract. Now, Shazia has remained in this job, I think, almost 2 years, I think from 2019 till now. And because she lacks the skills and the qualifications to progress, she's still in that same very job. In addition, with her poor mental health, she often has to take time off work, and she's very unsure if other employers will afford her the flexibility she needs. So what I've come to see, along with Shazia, many other women as well, these women will remain on the benefits pathways indefinitely. There is no way that they can get their own housing. The rents are too high. The mechanics of what they require monetarily is impossible for them to achieve. And along with the impact of their mental and physical health, one can say that the quality of their life and their future prospects is pretty, well, not great, really. Now, studying migration within and across geopolitical structures with a strong emphasis on the personal dimension, I have found it really useful to examine the psychospatial effects, the psychosocial, and the psychosomatic elements of the migratory experience. It's not much, you don't get the full holistic picture if you only focus on the psychospatial or the psychosocial or the psychosomatic. It is really important to see all of these three together in their overlapped and in their depthness to get a full picture of what is happening in a person-centered way. And therefore, I've called it the migratory physmos, a set of overlapping variables that illuminate the complexity of the situation in which migrants like Shazia find themselves. And as, of course, for today's talk, I have tried to shed light on their struggles to enter and remain in the job market. So to finish, firstly, I'm hoping that my research on the multivariant fallouts of domestic abuse on newly arrived South Asian women's experiences of life after marital breakdown, I'm hoping that it will positively contribute to broader anthropological discourse on transnational familyhood and marriage migration. And of course, secondly, I would like to suggest that current research on the barriers to employment faced by migrants has tended to focus on issues such as educational level, cultural and familial attitudes, stereotyping by potential employers, migrants' abilities to bond with and bridge their migratory context, the illegality, life stage, or caring responsibilities. But I'm hoping that I have demonstrated that my emphasis on a set of variables, which I've called the migratory physmos, the psychospatial, the psychosocial, and the psychosomatic factors in migration, will offer some potential to fill gaps in current discourse and shed new lights on the relationship between all of these three elements. And in this way, I'm hoping that one could use this conceptual framework in different geopolitical contexts as well, not just within the UK, which of course is my focus of study. Well, I hope what I have said so far has been interesting for all of you. And yeah, thank you very much for letting me participate.
Thank you so much, Nassim. I think we'll move on to our last speaker, Anna.
Yeah, hello, thank you. Let me just share the a very short presentation. Let me see here. Can you, oh well, it's open.
Not yet. The presentation's not on the screen yet.
Okay, can you see it?
Yep, we can see it now.
Excellent. Yay. Okay, so well, thank you for the invitation. I'm also a social anthropologist. Actually, it's very nice to see my good friend Dee on the screen. And how are you? Also, actually really good. I remember when we met back in the days.
Yeah, 2018.
Well, let's see. Anyways, I'm part of the social anthropology department at St. Andrews, and I'm just going to give you a very short introduction of my work, my research. So my research has focused on the study of migration through an analysis of care as an economic, ethical, and political practice in settings characterized by precarity. I have particularly focused on Latin American migrants, and it's linked to global social inequality in various geographic settings, such as the UK, Spain, and the and the US. I will kind of explain how these three sites, very different sites, connect to one another. So the aim of my research is basically to understand how people overcome social and economic adversity via investigating the economic, political, and moral strategies that they use in the process, and also to show how social, racial, and gender practices inform those strategies. My interest in the study of morality and ethics within anthropology takes into account a feminist ethics of care that, as Joan Tronto suggests, and here's a quote, departs from the understanding of individuals as relational subjects, and explains how moral thinking is influenced by people's responses toward others. So I approach ethics as an activity tied to concrete circumstances in order to understand people's experiences and moral problems in everyday life. So let me explain how this interest has developed in various research projects, which all of them involve Latin American migrants. Okay, so, well, this is a quote by one of my interlocutors. Sometimes I feel this is like a dream. When this is over in December, I will go back to my life and my son in Brazil. Everything go back to normal. I will go back to who I really am. So Sabrina, who has been working as a sex worker in London, she's originally from Brazil. She tells me this at the flat where she worked in the city when we were talking about her migration journey. You name it, there are so many reasons, but we keep on coming and we end up being maids or whores. So my PhD research tells the story of a group of middle-class women from Latin America who work temporarily as sex and domestic workers in London. As an ethnography of labor and migration, my work talks about the stories of women who find themselves trapped in the middle of a care crisis that oils the engines of global neoliberalism, whereby women from the global south seek to address the precariousness by filling the needs and gaps created by neoliberal policies in the global north. The point of departure of my analysis centers on the construction of a particular type of person, which is the middle-class migrant who worked as a care worker, with very little opportunities in the new country due to a lack of social connections, English skills, and documented statuses. Basically, these women who previously identified themselves as middle-class women in Latin America, they are pulled into occupations that they considered menial or lowly. As a result, women experience a series of significant fractures in their sense of selves that relate to class, racial, and social identifications. I explore these ruptures or these dislocations by considering the way in which women, more than economic actors, are involved in the shaping of intimate relations within and outside the care work market, and how in the process of doing this, they themselves, as ethical actors, find themselves shaping new relationships and enacting new futures, immersing the logic of a transnational global market of care. In this research, an ethics of care approach offers fertile ground to show the connections between caring as an ethical, economic, and social practice. On the one hand, I analyze care as a commodity sold within care markets, while on the other hand, I show how care as an ethical practice can help women to manage the commodification of intimacy that is embedded in both occupations, domestic and sex work. It can also become a mechanism to resist the inequalities of care work, and it's also a practice that includes the possibility of not caring. My work shows how global care migration shapes the hope, aspirations, and transnational life projects of these middle-class women in the UK. Over the years, I have maintained contact with the women I work with, and I have followed their transnational trajectories that have included returning back to their countries of origin or engaging in new migration journeys. So then my PhD research led me thinking about what sort of contribution does the care lens afford when studying migration. In this regard, following my analytical, empirical, and theoretical interest on migration, care, gender, and social inequality, my postdoctoral research allowed me to broaden the field of my research. The care crisis that I study in Spain does not focus on the role of the household, neither focuses on the way in which people like my interlocutors in London fill the care gaps by offering their care labor. But I am referring to a care void left by the consequences of the economic crisis of 2008 in Spain and the austerity policies that have challenged the link that existed between welfare and care. In contrast with my PhD research, where I focus solely on migrants, in my research in Spain, the groups of migrants I work with found themselves reconfiguring their migration projects alongside Spanish nationals and other ethnic minorities in Madrid, while participating in resistant practices against austerity policies. Oh, sorry. This research was part of a collaborative project. In my own research, which took 11 months of fieldwork in Madrid with this movement called a Platform of People Affected by Mortgages, a Stop Evictions movement, my research question was, how does an ethic of care look like when brought in the political and public domain? So during 2016, I did fieldwork with this anti-eviction movement founded in 2009 that has been used to help people affected by debt and mortgages during the economic crisis. The PA has become an alternative space for advice and resistance among people struggling with housing problems, debt, and evictions. So while doing research, I investigated the role of care as an ethical collective practice that reconstructs and forges relations of responsibility, notions of social justice and rights among people who face everyday precarity. My analysis acknowledges the way, when talking about the particular groups of migrants that were involved in this group, I focused particularly on Latin American migrants, but I also had and developed contacts with migrants from Morocco. In my analysis, I try to acknowledge the ways in which the intersections of race, class, and gender and legal statuses affected people's positions and roles, including the division of labor within the movement. This is particularly important when talking about migrants. Migrants, as I found in Madrid, not only have to deal with the housing problems due to mortgages and evictions, but have to navigate the legal system in order to secure resident and legal permits. So my research in this case considers the liminal legal space that Spanish immigration law creates. And right now I'm looking into the ways in which migrants navigate these ambiguous locations. So I want to analyze the ways in which legal and state categories create interdependent systems of racialized exclusion and exclusion and care among disadvantaged groups. So I'm also interested in this research in exploring the types of masculinity and femininity that the ethos of the movement creates, and how they correlate with imaginaries of migrant racialized communities in Spain, particularly Latin Americans and Moroccans. My case shows how care and caring relations, in the case of the PA, are not always harmonious, equal, or devoid of conflict and power. So I focus again on an ethics of care because it raises broader questions about the shape of social and political institutions in our society. And the last thing I've been also working since 2014, I have done short stints. Let me just put the whole thing. Oh, sorry. Short stints of field work in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where economic and social, amongst the Hispanic communities, economic and social adversity for this community in Tulsa results from an inequality that is stratified by race, class, and a legal system that denies the existence and constrain migrants' opportunities in the US. This research has centered on the analysis of child-rearing arrangements and the development of networks of care and cooperation among migrant women, along with their families and communities, on the one hand, and also the engagement and disengagement that migrants have with early education programs for their children. So here, as in Madrid, notions of collective forms of care serve as a primary approach to poverty alleviation and access to resources. Here, basically this research, which I want to continue at some point, has entailed a comparative analysis of African American communities and Hispanic communities with two researchers who have been involved in this research, and the way in which these communities construct themselves. In the case of Hispanic, mainly Mexican migrants, construct themselves as undocumented migrants, valuable migrants because of their labor, and they are basically seen as groups that have opportunities, whereas African Americans, because of their very problematic racial locations, are considered a problem, and how both communities engage with basically NGOs, NGO sector aid and early education programs. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. Let me just wait. How do I stop presenting? Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we're going to proceed into some questions and some discussion points. If you guys have anything you guys want to bring up as well about each other's presentations, that would be amazing as well. But I think we can start with a general question. Darian?
Yeah. First, thank you all for coming, and really nice presentations. So, as we have researchers investigating into very different topics today, I'll start from questions that bring us together. So, what I find is a common feature of the work of all of you is close attention to the micro scale data. So, like, how and what does this methodological orientation can contribute to our macro level understanding of migration and labor, and how these two scales can interact.
Is there anybody who wants to go? Anna?
Yeah, I'll try to say something. I think I mean, in case of my research, which focused on life histories of women and their migration trajectories, which is really like focus, the experience of a micro scale sort of data. I think these micro scale data can be, if it's seen through the light of more like bigger data, can offer nuances and details of can enrich the big data that sometimes do not. I mean, the big data people who do the big data do not have access to the nuances and the details behind their numbers or behind the statistics or behind charts, etc. So I think that by looking at, even though they are very micro scale, and it's hard to, every time as anthropologists, I don't know, maybe economists are different a bit, but as anthropologists, we're always questioning, like, okay, but can you generalize, because you've done fieldwork with, like, a very sort of like a very small group of people. But I guess our aim is not really to generalize, but to offer this nuanced data to be taken into account as a way to complement the big sort of data, and in a way, see what, I mean, if we don't take into consideration the life experiences of these people in a detailed way, then the other data doesn't make much sense, I would say. Yeah.
Can I have a second go? Can I go second? So I think that the microdata is absolutely paramount, and I'll explain to you why, again, very much using an example to bring to light. So I've been teaching English. Now, there are so many ESOL classes in the UK. I would question, yes, if you looked at the quantitative data, you would say, oh, X number of people came to ESOL classes and attended ESOL classes. But the lived experience of what I have observed is that although these girls go to the ESOL class, will they actually speak the language outside? No, they don't have the confidence. Will that lead into a job? No, because they don't have the other ancillary things that they would need to be able to get into a job. So if the government in the UK is trying to use ESOL classes as a way to get into jobs, it's not happening. Point one. Point two, when these girls are on benefits, they have a job. They have a job coach. They have a job coach at the job center. All the job coach is trying to do is get them off the benefits, which means as soon as they are on benefits, they are pushed into doing menial jobs. What that means is for the government, they're off the benefits. But what is the progression of these women and their lives? Zero, because they will never be able to progress any more than a menial job, which means they will never be able to rent their own home or be a homeowner or to progress or even come to anything called so-called middle class. So if you are an NGO, for example, giving somebody English class is not enough. So I've been a coach to young people in a local school. What I had to do was not only coach them to get through their education, their A-levels, but then also take them into a job and then also go and speak to the employer to say, what are the impediments the student is facing? And then coach the student into being able to sustain the job. Now, if we cannot give you nuanced data, the government will say, oh, great, so many people have learned English. Oh, great, so many people are off benefits. But what is really happening qualitatively? Do you see the point? To get from A to B, you need qualitative data. Quantitative data is not going to give you the answers, in my opinion.
That's a very good point. Because the gap between the macro level and the micro level data will get the policies that in the field to really serve the migrants.
Not only that, but it is the quality of the service that is being provided. The job coach is supposed to provide more service than just get the girl off benefits, for example. Or the ESOL teacher has to do a little bit more than just make sure that this girl is getting through the levels. It's not actually getting them into jobs, if that's what the government is really trying to do.
Yeah, maybe I can say something. I think that economists, we have a different point of view on that, actually. But actually, at the same time, I think that it is a quite, it is not actually a debate or a different perspective. I would start saying that both approaches are actually complementary, right? But on the other hand, I will also say that the use of microdata, I'm talking about individual level data, has been experiencing a revolution in the last decades or so, not only in terms of identification methods, but also on the granularity of the data, right? So, for instance, most of the immigration research in economics now uses census data, for instance. So the external validity of the results is guaranteed. I mean, we are observing the whole population, right? But of course, there are many other dimensions that microdata do not capture. And that is why economists, more and more, we are using ethnographic data. Just, there is this whole revolution done by Nathan Nunn, for instance, or by Melody Xu, that is now at LSE, or by Stelios Mykanopoulos, right? Who uses all these ethnographic data in combination with micro-level data to really pinpoint all these characteristics of immigration that my colleagues have been talking, right? Of course, economists, we love data, we love maths, we believe that makes us a little bit more interesting, which I think that, it depends on the perspective, right? But I totally agree. I mean, ethnographic data and trying to really understand the histories behind these phenomena is super important. right? I totally agree that ultimately, and that is what I highlight when I'm teaching in St. Andrews, ultimately, yes, we are analyzing censuses or we are analyzing surveys or whatever, but behind each observation, there is a history, there is an individual, right? And therefore, if we want to fully understand the immigration decision and therefore design integral immigration policies, we really need to bring together every field to work not only together, but in a more complementary way in order to, again, design more effective and more integral immigration policies.
Can I just supplement one point on that? Is actually, if we think about for the study of migration from either economic point of view or from the discipline of anthropology, so fundamentally there is as far as I understand, we want to inform at some point, even this is controversial in the discipline of anthropology, but we want to in a way representing the people in the vulnerable positions and then trying to request for the reform in the policy level. And then if that's the case, we have to take the stories and experience and also the point of view perceptions of the people on the ground, the people who is suffering seriously. And then often when we do the big data on the we can see the trend, but we unnecessarily impose a kind of a classification error. In a way, we don't really see the problems as how the people on the ground see it, classifies it. So that's another kind of contributions, micro the data from the ground generated from the experience on the ground can contribute to this policy kind of consultancy in a way.
I guess my question is I think you guys talk a bit about policy and on a policy level what things get changed. I guess like Dee briefly brought up that this point is perhaps a bit controversial in anthropology in terms of how much I guess like utilization of these types of data like contributes to your to a policy level. So I would like to ask, like in your individual projects and perhaps like some thoughts on it, have you guys worked with like policymakers or have you guys talked with policymakers and tried to enact some of the things that you guys been researching or you all have been researching in policy, and how has that process been going, if that makes sense?
Shall I continue with that?
Yeah.
Then, yeah. Okay. So others can follow the. I personally haven't, and then part of the reason is if you only talk about anthropology, it's exactly because the kind of we take individual cases and personal experience as the kind of more valuable. And then the contextualization of certain case studies is more valuable than seeing the statistics, seeing the trend. So in a way, it's very difficult for kind of the policymakers to see, to build the channel and to see the value of the anthropologists. So, but that doesn't mean, I know certain anthropologists in Oxford at the moment are actively trying to open up the channels for communications, get engaged with policy making. But again, within this process, how anthropologists position ourselves is another issue. Is is in what group we're trying to representing, and then for what purposes. So in a way, just because the characteristics of a discipline, so it's a bit difficult to for the policymakers to pay attention to the anthropological ethnographic data, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is perhaps one of the areas in which economists, we have like a little bit more attention, I would say, right? Because, you know, all the econometric models that we estimate provide a very specific, if you wish, effect at the extensive and intensive margin. And therefore, this is, you know, super valuable for policymakers in the sense that ultimately behind any policy, there is a budget, right? So you really need to know how much this policy, whatever it is, will cost to a certain government or governmental unit, right? In particular, I've been working closely with policymakers. I worked in the World Bank actually for a while before starting my PhD, and I would say that there are many other factors that influence the policy making process, not only the data or the microdata or the results, right? And here I'm talking about more about the political economy behind the policy making process, right? So it's a little bit complex. It's not that straightforward that, you know, the World Bank will take a paper written by a number of people, and then they will say, oh, yes, here are these results, let's make a policy. It doesn't work that way, right? Actually, most of the times, these policies are developed over the time, right? There are long processes, and there are many workshops sometimes that are implemented to gather all these ideas, right? Many scholars are invited, say, to DC to present some insights, to evaluate the programs, economists that are hired to evaluate ideas, to design some pilots, and then say something about the effectiveness of a potential policy. So in that sense, I would say that perhaps the training of economists allow us to be a little bit more engaged, but let me engage in policy. But let me again highlight that more and more sociologists, anthropologists, psychologists are consulted in the policy-making process because as social scientists, I would say, all of us will agree that immigration is a multidimensional phenomenon, right? And just a result of an econometric model is not enough to design, again, integral and effective policies.
Can I add something? And this is not per se, not from my personal research, but during COVID, the LSE Anthropology Department was consulting with the government on a policy that they were on some rules and regulations within the COVID period about how funerals were going to be conducted within communities. So a group of 20 of us came together in the department, and we all went off to our own local communities and got back the kind of the opinions of our leaders and what we thought they would want of how the funerals should be conducted during COVID. We then prepared a paper and we sent it up to where whoever was doing it within the government level, and it was actually our voice was heard, and it did impact the kind of rules and regulations that were put around the funeral ceremonies within communities during the COVID period. So this is a very sort of present day example of how anthropologists were informing government policy.
Okay, thank you so much. I think to move on, I think in some senses, I think we're curious about I guess the perhaps like structural inequalities that migrants might face, and I guess both in terms of like social barriers, in terms of histories, and like spatial histories, as David's research point out, and of course like different locales as well, which all of you have researched in different places, like migration in different places and different contexts. So I guess what I'm curious, or what we are curious about, is how these perhaps different locales, different spaces, may impact like the research and like the conclusions that you all have drawn in your research. That makes sense. Maybe start with David.
Sure. Yeah, so this is another feature that is super interesting about fine-grained data, right? Because fine-grained data or local level data allows you to identify heterogeneity in terms of space, as you just mentioned, right? And at least from my projects, it's very clear that the incentives to move vary substantially, even within states, right? And if you consider that, at least in my case, I have been studying immigration from Mexico and immigration from Canada, and these are very large territories, then if you look to the micro level, talking about at the county or at the municipality level, or even at the neighborhood level, then you would see that the incentives to migrate, or the selectivity of the migrants, or even the assimilation of migrants by origin changes a lot. And I guess that the natural connection here is that, again, these individuals have very specific or particular histories, and therefore we need to consider them. Economists, we have designed a number of methods to control for all this variation, because, and here I guess that my colleagues will agree, we are more interested in average results, right? Like more like the extensive margin of the phenomena, but because that informs policy overall, I would say. But we are, we know that this heterogeneity exists, and we try to analyze it as much as possible in order to provide a comprehensive analysis of immigration overall.
Can I go next? So when we talk about space, most generally we talk about community or locale or city or country. But actually, in my case, one of the biggest and most difficult spaces are the home, within the home, the kind of abuse that is going on within the home, and the way the walls of the home can become places of confinement for these women need to be analyzed quite carefully. Simultaneously, the structures that we always talk about are either governmental structures or global structures. But in fact, for the women in my study, the structure of the family is equally controlling and shackling for them as might be the government, the immigration rules that they then have to abide by. So there is this a cage within a cage, a space within a space, which actually is confining. It's quite interesting as a phenomenon, in my opinion. So yeah, so what I'm trying to say here is we need to rethink what space might be in our analysis, because home as a space is also a confinement space, can become.
Maybe Anna?
Yes, let me just rephrase your question. Were you asking about how are the experiences of migrants entangled with wider frameworks of structural inequality?
Yeah, structures inequality and space in general. So like how does space impact I guess like in your research, you talked about how you brought care kind of out of the domestic realm to like towards the outside. So how the space and spatial contexts impact your research.
Okay. Space in relation to literally for example, in this case, the spaces where women work and the spaces where activists work. Yeah. Are we talking? Okay. Okay, that's well, but probably very similar to what has been said already. You know, in the case of the domestic and the sex workers, of course, the spaces where they work have an effect not only on the research that we do, but also they're just basically, in this case, the domestic spaces, you know, the houses where domestic workers worked, or the brothels or the flats where sex workers worked, are basically reproducing these. It's just a space where women find themselves being sort of like to find themselves not only reproducing roles that they were doing beforehand, before migration, but also there are spaces that reproduce structures of inequality, wider structures of inequality. In the case of domestic work would be, the relationship between employers and employees, and abusive relationships that represent. And in the case of sex work, you know, likewise. In the case of the other, for example, the research in Spain, the spaces reconfigured, the spaces of care, they are reconfigured in the public sphere, but still, you know, these sort of like activist groups, even though they are trying to push an agenda, democratic agenda and an all-inclusive agenda, and try to basically create subjects that are kind of like interacting in a collective forms of care, they are also at times, you know, reproducing these structural inequalities in which migrants are trapped, because migrants participating in these sort of like processes. In the case of the research in Spain, their roles in these spaces are always cross-cut by their undocumented statuses, by the racial identifications, by class positions, and that in itself places them in a particular position within these collective spaces. So I think there is this, we cannot forget about this entanglement of how the spaces actually can protect people from structural inequalities, but at the same time can be spaces where these inequalities are just enhanced in one way or the other.
I think I might have misunderstood at the beginning what your question was, but just following on the spatialization, how that in a way can be utilized on the ground by different group of people to demonstrate or materialize the power. So in my case, I was talking about how a range of accommodations, but also how different spatial allocations actually is a way of segregating different groups, especially along the racial lines, and then very much is demonstrated through the kind of a farmers market every Tuesdays I go to, because it's not just how Chinese using the workspace to segregate along the racial lines, but also the local people using local government using the market trading places to segregate between the Chinese and the local products as well, in a way, in the name of protecting the local producers. So because I was shadowing one of the private farmers, Chinese farmers, who grew vegetables for the everyday tradings. So I frequently attend the Tuesday kind of local farmers market. So the spatial allocations, you have typically the local producers, local farmers occupies the center, where has the overflow of the customers, and then usually the Chinese merchants or Chinese traders are specialized in outside the main trading areas in the four corners, and then they are only allowed to trade certain vegetables or products, not all. So the popular products are locally can produce that they're not allowed to trade. So in a way, by allocating the market space, stores, so utilizing the spatial positions, you can actually the government actually by regulation or by to kind of create feelings of segregation between the migrants group and also the host communities. But also not just on that point, but also as you may have known, China is building so-called free trade zones, or they call it special economic zones across the whole Africa, which the deal is within these zones, the local African government can't put tax. So and then they will allow the certain kind of a administrative management, and also bureaucratic kind of tasks allocated to the Chinese companies and the Chinese organizations who took these initiatives to establish their branches there. So in a way, they kind of how to say, circle an area within a sovereign territory, but the state sovereignty can't control it. So the space here plays a way of saying, reminding of the constraints of the local sovereignty or local government sovereignty, how it's perceived, and then how that will influence the African workers' perceptions on what the zone is, and then what Chinese power, state power is, and also is actually can produce a byproduct, produce aspirations for workers, African workers work to find more work in those zones, because the activities and because the low tax, etc. So the activities mainly happening in those zones. So that's just some thoughts, basically.
Can I add one more point? I don't know how to theorize it or how to conceptualize this, but the girls within my research, once they are fleeing their homes, they're put into safe homes. But within the safe homes, there is so much politics between the different ethnicities that coexist, that in some cases, not so much in the safe home, but in the home office accommodation, I have several stories where there is so much conflict between the housemates because they're culturally so different. So some may want to drink and bring in boyfriends and blah, 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 blah. And there are some other women who will want just the opposite. So much so that there is so much conflict that the police has to get involved. In one case, the girl was so badly abused that she actually refused to live there and had to go back into a safe home from what they call a house of multiple occupancy. The point, I don't know how exactly to theorize this space, because a bigger structure is giving space for you to live in the hope that you will be safe, but there is no safety within, although titled a safe home or home of multiple occupancy. The word home doesn't necessarily mean safety, and it's really an interesting thing. And it happens to all the girls I've studied. And it's actually quite scary sometimes. I can give you one more story, and it is really, really horrendous, because what the government does is, the minute you claim asylum, they will first put you in a hotel before they can find you a home of multiple occupancy. And sometimes you will shuttle from one hotel to another. Within the hotels, these girls get solicited by men because it's a mixed gender place. They're solicited for sex, they're solicited for all kinds of things. So a girl is arriving here highly traumatized from all the abuse that she's experienced at home, and then she gets re-abused within these spaces before she then moves to another space. So they're moving from space to space to space for a period of almost 2 years till they finally land somewhere where they can live. Yeah. It's not a good story, but this is happening to quite a few women.
I think one of the response just some initial kind of reaction to that is the space often. I think one as Anna and also sorry Javier, sorry I don't know how to pronounce your name. Has
My name.
demonstrated. Yeah, sorry.
Nassim. Nassim.
Nassim.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry. Demonstrates how the space is gendered. So so in a way how these issues arise because we when we're talking about space and spatialization is very much a kind of homogenizing the space, but space is not just a space as a unified, it's gendered, and also that's why the value of this kind of affective studies on how spatialization, especially with the migrants, different migrant groups spatializing and sensing their space is more important, is how they understand. Yeah, that's just my initial reaction to it.
Can I add to that? Yeah, totally. But as Nassim probably will agree with me, it's not only, and also you. I mean, it's gender, but it's also racialized, and it's across like all these intersections, right? Which we cannot ignore. I mean, in the case of, for example, the sex workers or domestic workers I work with, it was, of course, gender is the main factor, but also which sort of which racial identification that they have and how class also is intersecting with that. So if we take all these intersections in the production of space, then we can understand how it reproduces, but it also reflects structural conditions of inequality that are precisely embedded in these sort of like levels of difference, right? Yeah. Space is not lived or experienced in a neutral way.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that's what I was curious about. I think David, in your like the maps that you were drawing of the Mexican Revolution and the refugees and the migrants, I was curious if in the like perhaps in the census data or the historical data that I've used how was the like I guess both class and like racial distribution of like these like migration patterns and like different time periods, I guess. Like have you looked into that?
Yes, that's a super interesting question. And that is something that, again, micro level data allow us to say something about it. So I will give you two examples, right? So Mexican immigration in the early 20th century was basically constituted by single males of age between 18 and 23 years old. So for you to have a sense of how we know all these characteristics, the data that we digitized or that I digitized during my PhD are these immigration cards that basically report 43 individual characteristics, right? Including, sex, age, previous occupation, place of birth, place of residence before crossing the border, destination, port of entry, birthday, etc. There are many observables there. So basically what you can do is to break down or to crunch all this data and actually see who is crossing the border, right? This is the case of Mexican immigration to the United States. Now, I'm also currently working with a colleague that is based in LSE, Chris Mintz, and we are studying Canadian immigration to the United States. And this is super interesting because Canadian immigration has these two dimensions that you just mentioned. In the one hand, you have a clear ethnic composition, meaning French and British immigrants. And then something that is super interesting about this data is that you can see that the composition of the immigration flow is more balanced. Actually, you have like a kind of 51% of the observations are males and 49% are women. right? And this is something that we didn't know. We have in mind that basically during the age of mass migration, meaning from the 1850s to the 1920s, almost all immigrants were, young males. But with this data, with this fine-grained data, we are telling a different story. And what we are observing there is that we are actually female Canadians migrated at that time. They were single, they were young, and they were responding to incentives of the growing American economy, which is something that, it was difficult to think for that period of time due to the gender rules that were present in that specific period. So again, not because I am obsessed with microdata, right? But I believe that all these characteristics of immigration are only observable when you have not only this fine-grained data, but that volume of data that actually is representative for a whole migration flow, in this case, Canadian immigration to the United States, right? But just to wrap up, what I'm trying to say is that indeed, immigration is a phenomena that is, characterized by different dimensions that when you break it down, then you can see that different ethnicities, different socioeconomic characteristics play a role in explaining who migrates.
Thank you. Darren, do you want to move into a more specific question?
Yeah, I have questions like, on the one hand, connecting back to what we are discussing, that is the issue of space, but also about emotions. That is another common thread of many of the work of the anthropologist present today. So this question is quite targeted at youth work in Chinese forms in Zambia, but I think it's also open to all. So I've read like your work on affect, like the relations between emotions and the situations, and how emotions is governed in these work circumstances. And as you've mentioned today, like this socialist labor management regime is inherited by the now privatized operators of these forms. So my question is, like, how can we interpret like the role of this socialist element in constructions of the emotions and identities of the Chinese manager class in Zambia, and how this also governs the relations between like Chinese and Zambian people, and especially with regard to emotions and how emotions are spatialized. Yeah.
So it's right. First of all, I want to clarify. So when we're talking about emotions, and we can talk about emotions in different levels, and then what I really emphasized on was basically, especially in my book, was really on so-called structural feelings. So and also how it's historical kind of dimensions within how the emotions and affect is produced. So let me give you ethnographic kind of evidence or examples on this. Is how recently I think lots of people have been talking about, especially in the media, talking about how local Africans are perceiving the Chinese communities or Chinese migrants as a threat, as a new colonizers. but one that is based on very much a kind of a analytical structure on how the globalization following the capital and following the neoliberal capital, how inequality plays out. And then, but on the other hand, they ignore the history between China and Africa in the 1960s and 1970s, when African countries got independent during that period of time. And especially the heyday, that was also the period of time of the heydays of Chinese communist kind of, how to say this, structuring of the state, building up of the state as well. So on the ground, how it's manifested is during that time, lots of Africans got scholarships and also free education in Moscow or in Russia, Soviet Union. So they was trained and also practiced a couple of years before, headed back to their own countries to take charge of certain industries. And in my case, is the farm owner who is actually belongs to the University of Zambia, who managed the University of Zambia farm, which is cooperated with the Chinese educational farm because we're using the land, etc. And then there's a cooperation between the two. And then he was trained in Moscow at that time. And then one day he came to talk with me, and then sharing, I was asking, what's your perceptions on Chinese activities, engagement, etc. And then he was saying his only concern is China will be like Soviet Union and collapse overnight. And then they would not finish the projects they were doing for the Africans. And then it suddenly reminds me how this perceptions would contrast with the younger generation of Zambian workers who are educated, also grew up in a very different environment, and then inherited a very different kind of sentiment towards to the Chinese investment in a way. So this is just one of the demonstrations how the affect and also the emotions attached to especially in the international relations level, how it can be historically historicized. We need to historicize more about this in order to bring it more. So yes, so there's a more nuanced, in a way, more nuanced within how local Africans perceive Chinese activities.
Do anybody have any general comments on, I guess, affective structures or just like emotional structures within their research? Or if not, we can also move on to other more specific questions as well.
Sorry, I forgot to mention another thing is if you approach emotion and affect as a process of embodiment, then it very much speaks to the experience of migration within their own kind of identity in a way. So different people, for example, will embody their status or their identity different ways.
Yeah, I also have a question for Dr. David. That is, like in the contemporary discussions about refugees, there is quite a dispute about the nature of this class of migration. So, like, what's the origin of them? Do you think that your work on the relations between local violence and the migration pattern can contribute can provide us some new perspectives or some historical evidence about contemporary refugee crisis, the origin of contemporary refugee crisis?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for this question. It's super interesting. Actually, when my co-authors and I started thinking about doing something on refugee migration, we start talking about the fact that, if you look at the current situation in Afghanistan, we all saw all these striking images of people trying to leave the country, right? But at the same time, we realized that there were many other people willing to stay, right? So ultimately, the fact that there is a conflict in a country, that doesn't imply that it is affecting everyone, right? And what we realized is that, at least in the field of economics, in the profession, we know relatively little about what are the drivers of refugee migration, right? As a natural response, anyone will say, yeah, it is the presence of violence, it is the presence of destruction, it is the presence of conflict that is driving this immigration, or this emigration, sorry. But when you look a little bit closer, then you realize that there are many other factors involved, right? And I believed, or at least let's see what the results show in 8 months or so, 6 months, hopefully, that there are other factors that could explain these flows of refugees, right? So in my presentation, I highlighted some of them, right? And what is crucial, what I have been thinking recently, is whether you sympathize with any of the factions involved, and whether these factions that you sympathize with won or not. So I will give you a historical example just for you to have a sense of what I'm saying. So one of the main objectives of the Mexican Revolution was the distribution of land, right? There was a huge inequality in terms of accessing to land, and therefore it was one of the main drivers of the Mexican Revolution, right? However, there were different factions involved. One of them was in the south, which was led by a landowner named Zapata, or Emiliano Zapata, right? And you will see that there is huge conflict there at the local level. We saw a lot of battles, a lot of sieges there in the south, but this faction was actually one of the main losers of the Mexican Revolution, right? So what we observe, and that is why this temporal dimension matters, is that yes, this faction had some wins, and the peasants there supporting this faction stayed for a while. But then in the moment when this faction started to lose, right, then the incentives to live increased, right? So what I'm saying here is I believe that these historical events can inform current or can inform our understanding of current refugee migration by shading some, by providing some evidence on which factors could be present in nowadays conflicts as well, right? Basically, civil wars, although nowadays there are many other war technologies and many other things that have changed, still, the violence, the destruction of infrastructure, and the incentives are basically, in my view, the same, right? Basically, you want to escape some kind of destruction, you want, or refugees are seeking for a better life outside, right? Because their interest or their, life conditions were affected in some way. However, we still need to understand in which way in order to have a better understanding of refugee migration. And, well, we'll see, but we are trying to study these incentives using or studying the case of the Mexican Revolution. But this was only possible because we found these amazing books written by historians, by military historians, that reported all these data. Without that, it would be basically impossible to say anything, right? And as I mentioned during my presentation, if you want to gather all that data nowadays, it's basically impossible because all the military reports are sealed. You can have access to them, right? But if you study the historical event, then you can, if you are lucky and you find them in the archives, you can get all this data that we digitized in the last year.
Can I add something on incentives for migration? And I want to flip it on its head, because in the cases that I've studied, there is an incentive for the spouse living in the UK for wanting a spouse from back home. So the statistics say that between 2004 and 2018, some 53% of British-born Pakistani Muslim spouses were married to co-ethnics from Pakistan. The point I'm making is that marriage migration is still a very big phenomenon. But again, this is no generalization. But of the women that came in my study, they were marrying men with mental health problems that was hidden from them. It was really interesting. In one case, the husband was already married to a woman here, but because he had done a nikah, it was not an official marriage, he brought the second woman, the woman that I was studying, to the UK because he wanted her to have children. He couldn't have children with his first wife or the wife he had here, and so she comes along. 4 of the women I studied were married to men without their knowledge with mental health problems. No, 5. So the point I'm making is that there is an incentive for the migrant from the global south to come to the global north, but there is also an incentive from the people in the global north to want somebody to migrate from the global south. So what I'm trying to do is flip the incentivization for migration on its head here, actually, if you see what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, like we need to pay attention not only to the incentives of those who are being moved, but also those who are waiting for move. Who are waiting for further,
who are bringing somebody across.
Yeah.
In some cases, the birth dates of the girls were changed to make them older so that they could get their visas to come across. 3 cases. And I studied only 9. If I studied 90, I wonder how many more I would have found.
Yeah, I think as we're moving to the end of our discussion, I'll bring up a question to Anna. So I think in our general folk theories of migration is all about how migrants from underdeveloped places to seek class mobility through migration. But as you've mentioned, like in London, this downgrade experience of Latino middle class. So my question is that how they renegotiate their identities through this change and how they deal with this frustrated aspiration. Yeah.
Yes, it's actually very different. This Latin American migration to the UK, very different from, for example, the Mexican migrants I work with in Oklahoma, or what David will find, for instance. We have these ideas of, these migrants from Mexico that migrate to the US, with the Bracero program, agricultural workers. In the case of the UK, I mean, one thing that happened to me is that when I started, with this long field work that I did, women, they will talk about themselves as, identifying as middle class back in their countries. The thing, because I didn't do multi-sited fieldwork and I was only, in the UK and in Madrid, somehow, you have to take, I basically took what they said, right? Okay, if they see themselves as middle class migrants, they are middle class migrants, right? And actually, the way in which they talked about it, it could be, this woman definitely could be placed because of the levels of education and, certain consumption practices and a sort of like aspirations. They were definitely more in the down, lower middle class. And of course, this is one of the main frustrations that they experience when getting into the UK. They actually have to get to start working in these jobs that are considered the lowest of the jobs back in their countries, right? Because in their countries they are employing domestic workers who will be mainly indigenous women from all these different countries. This is across, the Bolivians, the Brazilians, the Colombians. It was a similar sort of like experience. So even though they experience downward like status mobility in the UK, because not only because of the jobs that they're taking, but also because of the money they're making, they reconfigure their middle classness by separating or distinguish, like making distinctions between them and other migrants. So they are able ideologically, even though economically speaking, they do not belong to the middle classes anymore in the UK. They still ideologically and symbolically, they maintain certain aspects by, for example, differentiating them from, for example, other migrants who, and I sort of like quote, they would be more indigenous than they were. They also, for example, they always identify themselves as white or mestizo migrants, never, very few from Brazil, which had like a mix of, or had black ancestry, they would identify themselves as, a morenos or pretos, or, sort of like mixed. But these racial identifications, these distinctions with other migrants, for example, distinctions even with migrants that other migrant groups in the UK, the distinction of them being white and being white, or identifying themselves as white, which in Latin America we know it's a very complex sort of like the identification. But for example, in relation to migrants from South Asia, it was like, for example, they will always talk about the Indianos, people from India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, as being different because of because of the fact that they were brown and some of these women were not, or British Black, also populations in the UK. So it's kind of like, it just confirms, these sort of like very, very subtle and not very subtle racisms, that they engage with, help them in sustaining a form of class position that was not real, but ideally speaking, they could maintain it in order basically to survive and to maintain their middle class aspirations that were part of their migration projects, right? Because these are not, it's this whole discussion, right, about who are the economic migrants. I think it's not whether you are only an economic migrant or not. Many of these women, they migrated because of, for example, lots of them were highly in debt back in their countries, but also many of them migrated because they just wanted to run away from kinship obligations, to find love, for romance, romantic aspirations, etc. So I guess that's how they were just kind of like clinging to a notion of previous self in order to deal with the class dislocations that they were experiencing in the UK. Interesting. Sad, but very interesting.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, it was a very interesting conversation, very interesting discussion. Like different points of view from different places as well, and different locales. And yeah, thank you. We will put this recording on YouTube, and everybody can also watch it over as well. And yeah, thank you very much. And I'm going to stop the recording now.